All right. Hello, History 1102. Um, I suppose my preference would be that we wouldn't have to do any of these lectures in this manner online, where I'm just talking to you very impersonally over the computer. But unfortunately, I'm forced to do that by illness in this case. I think I'll be fine to see you again on Wednesday. I hope you're enjoying your break so far, though. Um, Now, with this lecture, I'm going to do the same thing I did with the Enlightenment lecture, where I also recorded it. When we meet in class again on Wednesday, I'll have you do just a very short quiz, 3 or 4 questions, just to check your comprehension of the basic, the big key points of this lecture. What I'm going to hopefully you'll focus on the most um, are the two ideologies we're going to introduce today through the lens of talking about 1848, which are the liberals and communists. So these two ideologies that will come to really define the 20th century along with nationalism. So with this lecture, you'll have gotten all three of the three big ideologies in the Western world, big political ideologies, and we'll be able to move on finally to the world outside of Europe, returning just in time for the First World War. I'm going to try to keep this lecture to around 50 minutes, but I might go a little over. If so, I apologize. I also apologize for my voice. I'm still a bit congested, a little sick. I was told by my coworkers that teaching middle school, you're going to get, like, the first year, you're going to be getting sick all the time. Luckily, that hasn't happened, but unfortunately, I'm sick now. So my voice might not sound great. I have some tea next to me, and luckily no one else is in the house, so there'll be no distractions of that sort. So without further ado, we'll begin. Now, the first topic I want to discuss is liberalism. And one of the most recent things we talked about before we talked about nationalism was the middle class. We talked kind of at length about the middle class, its aspirations. This is the political ideology that the middle classes in Western Europe, in places like Germany, France, Britain, what they find most appealing. Why do they find it most appealing? Why do they find liberalism so appealing? Liberalism is an ideology of progress, not of chaotic progress, not of revolution, of overturning everything, but of progress that is orderly, that is guided by those with the merit to do so, um, of, you know, an ideology of keeping what you've earned, of defending what you've earned. And for people like the rising middle classes in Europe, who, for the most part, are self made men, this is very appealing. So there are a number of key points in liberalism, and liberalism really emerges from the Enlightenment. They are in many ways the direct inheritors of the traditions of the Enlightenment, traditions of the Age of Reason, things we've talked about going back into the 1600s when we talked about the intellectual reactions to the religious wars in the 15 and 1600s. So here are just a few key points that sort of define liberalism, define the liberal ideology. And by liberal, I'm not talking about left wing. That's sort of more of an American thing to associate liberalism with the left. There are certainly left wing liberals, but liberalism itself is a broad ideology that today contains a large amount of the political right as well in America and much of the rest of the world. So one of the big beliefs of liberals is that a government is legitimate because of the consent of the people, not because of divine right or anything of that sort. They hold on to this old principle that governments derive their legitimacy, their right to rule, from the consent of those whom they rule. So liberals will usually advocate for extending the franchise, or extending the right to vote. They will usually support parliaments, Congress, government, these institutions that are elected by the people. Constitutionalism. Now, another thing that liberals believe in, and they're not always successful in getting this in every part of the world, but are clear restrictions encoded into the laws upon the power of the government. They believe in constitutions. For liberals throughout Europe, this is one of their most constant, consistent demands, is even if they live in a monarchy, even if they live under a system that isn't entirely liberal, they'll demand, they want a constitution to make clear what the powers of the government are and what liberties rest with the people at large. They want these things clearly defined. They don't want it left up to tradition or custom, the way it was in England for so long, the way it was in a great deal of the world. They want these restrictions clear and encoded in constitutions. Third, they want equality before the law. So they don't want aristocrats to have special privileges or rights, even though the French Revolution has happened. In many parts of Europe, the nobles are still holding on to their old privileges. They're still, in some cases, holding people as serfs in the Austrian Empire, in Russia, and in Eastern Germany. They still have certain political rights that the rest of the country doesn't have. Liberals, broadly speaking, oppose these unearned rights. They believe that everyone ought to be judged on their own merits, on their own ability, and not be handed things just because of who they're born as. Fourth, and this is quite important, liberals believe in a neutral state. A neutral state as in a government that doesn't pick winners or losers. A government that doesn't put its hand on the scale in the economy, doesn't subsidize certain industries over other ones, that doesn't protect its friends in the economy and hurt its enemies. And they don't want a government that'll do the same thing in politics. They want elections to be free, and they want the economy to be free. This is an extension of them not wanting unfair advantages. They believe that not allowing governments to do this, that if governments are neutral, that'll be better for the political system and better for the economy. And civil rights, for the most part. Liberals support extending the freedom of speech, freedom of religion, freedom of the press, freedom of expression. Now, of course, liberalism, very big ideology at the time. There are some liberals who are not as gung-ho about certain aspects of this list. Nevertheless, these are 5 key points around which we can sort of define the liberal ideology. Now we'll look sort of how it was applied. One of the most important proponents of liberalism in the 19th century was John Stuart Mill, who was an Englishman, an English philosopher. Now, his key idea was individual freedom, which he believed was the most important value in society. I'm going to read this quote he has about freedom of speech, the first one. If any opinion is compelled to silence, that opinion may, for all we know, be true. To deny this is to assume our own infallibility. He's saying that if you're forcing somebody not to voice their opinion, if a government stops someone's mouth and forces them to be silent, for all we know, they might be preventing the truth from coming out. Second, the only purpose for which power can be rightfully exercised over any member of a civilized community against his will is to prevent harm to others. This second quote is a statement of a very famous idea from Mill, which is the harm principle. The idea basically, if something doesn't harm another person, it is permitted. It should be permitted. This is not an idea that comes naturally to people in any way. Even if it's something you consider tremendously immoral, if it's not actually hurting someone, if it's not actually violating someone else's rights, then you cannot stop them from doing it. This idea is at the heart of the more left-wing type of liberalism that John Stuart Mill and others pioneered. Now, some of this will probably seem second nature to you, but let me reiterate, this is simply not the way people have thought throughout history. What we see in this course are people being thrown in prison, sometimes people being put to death for having different opinions on things, people fighting wars over religious opinions. John Stuart Mill and others like him want to put an end to anything like that. They want to put an end to people being persecuted for their beliefs and ideas. And this is a powerful statement of their opposition to that kind of repression. Now, the other aspect of liberalism, as I mentioned before, is this idea of freedom in the economy. This becomes a huge deal, especially to the middle class, who are people who are hoping to get ahead. And if you're just somebody starting out in the world, if you are not super well connected, if you're not an aristocrat, you want all the barriers to your economic activity to be blown aside. You don't want as much interference in the economy, because if somebody's interfering in the economy, by all chances, it's going to be against the upstarts. So the middle class mobilizes on a massive scale in countries like England and France, but especially in Britain, against government interference in the economy, against subsidies for certain industries. Now, the middle classes emerge as major supporters of what we call capitalism. And having used the word finally, after 18 lectures, I'm now compelled to describe it. It's not something particularly easy to describe, something particularly easy to define, and many, many different definitions have been given for capitalism, which is the economic system of choice for liberals in general, as we discuss them. So capitalism, according to the definition I've chosen to go with, is an economic and social system that features, first, private ownership over the means of production. Private ownership as in not the government, not the collective, individuals owning factories, owning farms, owning the tools with which materials are made, owning the materials themselves. Not owned by the government, not owned by a collective of people, owned by private individuals. Second, a capitalist economy operates under a profit motive, under the assumption that private individuals who own things will pursue their self-interest and attempt to maximize profit through making their products better, more efficient, cheaper. Will attempt to attract labor through making labor more palatable and better paying. That is an essential assumption of capitalism. And finally, a free market. A capitalist economy is not going to rely on a government determining where materials go. It's not going to determine, it's going to base itself on market signals, as in supply and demand, to drive prices. Where things are scarce, prices will go up. Where things are where there's a glut of things, prices will sink. That's the basic assumption. That's how things move around in a capitalist economy. This is one of the more powerful parts of capitalism, which is very difficult for any other system to really replicate, is the efficiency with which prices move up and down and adjust according to supply and demand. So one of the big, and I would invite you to pause on this slide to jot some of this down. This is quite important, especially when we come to later in this lecture talking about Marx's critique of capitalism and his understanding of capitalism and all of that. One of the big proponents, theorists of what would later be called capitalism, was someone who lived slightly before the era we're discussing, Adam Smith, definitely a figure of the Enlightenment. Also British, though a Scot, this time, not English. Has this quite famous quotation from his most famous work, The Wealth of Nations. It is not from the benevolence of the butcher, so it's not from their goodwill, the butcher, the brewer, or the baker that we expect our dinner, but from their regard to their own self-interest. We address ourselves not to their humanity, but to their self-love, and never talk to them of our own necessities, but of their advantages. When people operate in a capitalist economy, it's because they're seeking profit. They're going to do things for other people, not because they feel an obligation to, but because it's in their interest to do so. And Smith describes the means by which this drives along an economy. It is not from the benevolence of the butcher, brewer, baker we expect our dinner, but from their regard to their own interest. Now, some of his big enemies were tariffs, so taxes on imported goods, and monopolies. Monopolies being when a single individual or institution controls an entire sector of the economy. What he really wanted was competition. Competition in the economy. Competitions between businesses, between capitalists. He hoped that that would lower prices and increase wages. Now, that's the belief largely of all advocates for capitalism, of people who advance this economic theory, this economic system. Now, nationalism, as we discussed in the last lecture, is an ideology that can coexist with quite a few other ideologies and has coexisted with so many others. Part of what makes it so tremendously powerful to this day. Liberalism is no exception. There's not necessarily a contradiction between nationalism and liberalism. Although liberalism does lend itself to a more universal worldview, this doesn't mean that a number of countries aren't going to attach their national identity very closely to liberalism itself. Now, the real name of the statue you see on the left-hand side of your screen is not actually the Statue of Liberty. It is, perhaps somewhat tellingly, Liberty Enlightening the World. That's the name of the statue. That was commissioned in the 1880s, built by the French, and shipped over here, and set up facing Europe. Set up facing Europe. That is quite significant. Almost as an encouragement and admonishment to Europe. You made us. Look what we've become. And we're now spreading liberty to you. You gave us our identity, you gave us our start, but we've surpassed you. Now it's our turn to carry the torch. At the dedication speech given by President Cleveland, I believe this is in his first term, he was the first and until recently only president to ever serve 2 terms that were not one after the other, that weren't consecutive. He gives what I think is a rather enlightening, if I may say so, discourse. Instead of grasping in her hand thunderbolts of terror and of death, she holds aloft the light which illumines the way to man's enfranchisement. Enfranchisement means empowerment. We will not forget that liberty has here made her home, nor shall her chosen altar be neglected. A stream of light shall pierce the darkness of ignorance and man's oppression until liberty enlightens the world. In America, as you probably all know, the connection of this idea of liberty to the national identity is intense. This is an intensely strong association. In the UK, maybe not as much these days, I think kind of hoping to distinguish themselves from America, this has been a little bit de-emphasized there, but throughout the 19th and 20th centuries, the idea of liberty was tied very closely into the idea of what it meant to be British as well. So these are 2 countries in particular where liberalism and nationalism really fuse together, where liberty is associated with the nation is associated with liberty. This is in America and in the UK. Especially important when we're talking about the UK when we discuss the UK's interactions with Imperial China in a few lectures. And, as Grover Cleveland had pointed out, yes, liberty. He wants liberty to illumine the world. He wants liberalism to spread. It already has considerably. In 1830, a series of revolutions break out across Europe. Now, these aren't as widespread or earth-shattering as the revolutions of the 1780s and 90s, the French Revolution, and the descent of the French revolutionary armies across Europe. That doesn't happen again. But Belgium experiences a revolution. Belgium, in fact, becomes independent from the Netherlands and imposes a liberal constitution where it establishes the freedom of the press, freedom of religion, and freedom of association. Poland. Liberals in Poland, who are living under Russian rule, rise up against the Russians. They don't do as well as the Belgians do against the Dutch. But part of the reason the Belgians do so well against the Dutch is because the French are helping them. And by that point, the French have had their own revolution. We talked about how in 1815, so 15 years prior, the Bourbons are put back on the throne of France after Napoleon is defeated. In 1830, they're overthrown and replaced by a cousin of the family, the Duke of Orleans, Louis Philippe, who becomes king, but he becomes a constitutional monarch. We'll talk a little bit more about him later, and about the Bourbons who were overthrown. But suffice it to say, liberal revolutions spearheaded by the middle class, the upper middle class, rock Europe around 1830. This is a shattering blow to the world system, to the European system rather, that the powers had tried to set up after the French Revolutionary Wars. This is precisely what they'd been trying to prevent. And Metternich, the Austrian foreign minister, who we talked about a little bit, who was instrumental in trying to set up the system where you'd prevent revolution, he's in Vienna and he says simply, and I quote, "My life's work is destroyed." It'll get even worse for him, as we'll see. But it really did seem that way. Even in countries where there isn't a revolution, the liberals make tremendous advances. In 1831 and 1832, a reform bill is making its way through Parliament. This reform bill will lower the property requirements for voting, which means a lot, which means you have hundreds of thousands of people in Britain who were unable to vote now being entered into the electorate. The electorate expanding from roughly 1% of the population to 7%, which is still not most people, but it's still an increase of around 700%. That expansion of the electorate means huge numbers of new people coming into politics, new people voting. And the people voting are now people who are, yes, they're still well off, but they're not the top, the tippity top of the ladder. Now, the bill gets stalled for a while in the upper house of the Parliament, in the House of Lords, and the people of Britain, large numbers of them, threaten a bank run. The Duke of Wellington was leading the opposition to the bill, and they say, "Stop the Duke, go for gold." And that slogan essentially means if we're going to stop the Duke of Wellington from preventing the bill, if we're going to get this bill passed, we have to threaten a bank run. We're going to all go to the bank and ask to take our gold deposits out, which, if you go to a bank and ask to take out your deposits, all right, but if everybody does that at the same time, that can crash the economy. So with this threat and with the public mobilizing in support of the reform bill, the House of Lords decides to go ahead and pass it. And on the right, you have the royal signature from William IV, Le Roi le Veau, at the very top there, the classic formulation for the royal assent, and the bill itself. And on the left, you have a political cartoon, the reformers with all these axes attacking the corrupt voting system that had existed before, and of the king and Queen Amelia being greeted by symbols of the various constituent countries of the UK, the Scots, the Irish, and the English. That might actually be the Welsh, although I'm not sure. Now, in France, they've gotten a new king. Now, the king who's put back in power in 1815 when Napoleon's beaten is Louis XVIII. He was a political moderate. He was a brother of the executed Louis XVI. He was aware of what could happen if he overreached. Then when he died in 1824, his brother Charles took the throne. Now, Charles, the Duke of Anjou, takes the throne in 1824. As Charles X, he should have known better. He was also Louis XVI's brother, but he was an arch conservative, and he surrounded himself with people who wanted to bring the monarchy back to the days of Louis XIV. He did a number of things. So he renewed an old tradition whereby if there was this belief that if somebody had a certain skin condition, scrofula, and they were touched by the king's hand, that they would be healed. The tradition called the royal touch existed in Britain and in France. Now, in Britain, they hadn't done this for over 100 years. In France, it was the same way. They hadn't done that since the Revolution. Charles tries to bring that back. Most people think it's really ridiculous. He also renews laws about blasphemy, with the death penalty attached, although they're never actually enforced. The people of France are really not into this, especially the middle classes. And when he's overthrown, he's replaced by his cousin Louis Philippe, who's known as the bourgeois monarch, bourgeois being another name for middle class. You can sort of see that in the way they dress. Charles X looks like he could have stepped out of the early 18th or late 17th centuries in his royal garb, his robes studded in the Bourbon emblem, the fleur-de-lis, and the crown sitting next to him. Louis Philippe is in a simple soldier's uniform, the uniform of a soldier who fought in the French Revolutionary Wars for the Republic as a young man. He has the same sort of haircut as a bourgeois. He has a little bit of paunch, like a lot of the middle class gentlemen do as well. He looks like one of them. And he would cultivate this image throughout his reign, even as he became more repressive, as he abandoned these liberal roots. Louis Philippe would cling to this image of himself as a monarch for a modern age. Sort of the main centerpiece of this lecture, this discussion, are the revolutions that explode across Europe 18 years after 1830 and 1848. These are probably the most widespread series of revolutions that will take off in Europe. I suppose there are a few waves of these. There's 1790s, spread by the French armies. There's 1830, mostly in Western Europe. 1848. Then there are a whole bunch in 1918 after World War I. Then a whole bunch in 1991 as the Soviet Union collapses. But the 1848 ones are tremendously widespread. Nearly every single country in Europe experiences either a revolution or an attempted revolution. There are very few countries that are spared anything like this. The United Kingdom doesn't have any direct violence in Britain itself. In Ireland, there is some violence. I don't believe Spain has a revolution, although they have plenty of political chaos in this period, which we will unfortunately not have too much time to discuss. These revolutions are kicked off by a number of things. Now, first, the 1840s are a pretty nasty decade to be living in Europe. The industrial economies are just starting to kick off, meaning you have large groups of people in terrible working conditions moving into the major cities, working in factories for low wages, in tremendously awful working conditions like the ones we discussed in Lecture 16. You also have skyrocketing prices of food. Now, it doesn't break into outright famine in most of Europe, although it does in some places. Ireland loses well over 1 million people to a devastating famine caused by a potato blight. But the potato blight hits everywhere in Europe. It's just Ireland is in a particularly desperate situation because of how dependent the population is upon the potato. But in the rest of Europe, you have skyrocketing food prices, and in a city where things are already awful, in places like Vienna and Paris and Berlin, that can lead to revolution. Now, these uprisings are taken advantage of by an alliance of 3 broad political factions. The first, middle-class liberals, people who want to expand voting rights, who want constitutions, who want the nobility done away with. Nationalists, people who are members, who are living as subjects of multinational empires, people like Hungarians or Poles who want their independence, and Germans who want a single German state instead of all of these little German states dotted all over the place, and Italians who want to throw out the Habsburgs and create a unified Italy. And the third factor are these workers in the cities, these poor and hungry people who are furious at their bosses, who are furious at their government, many of whom want to overturn the capitalist system entirely, who want unemployment insurance, who want benefits, who want voting rights, like the liberals. Now, the thing is, all of these groups share certain goals. All of them want to take down the governments. All of them want to take down the aristocrats, and their similarities sort of end there to their to their detriment. Now, the revolutions kicked off almost simultaneously in 1848, this springtime of nations. In Vienna, students and workers began to clamor for freedom of the press, clamor for political representation. They take up arms. They lynch the Minister of War. Metternich, who by now is a rather elderly man, is forced to resign as prime minister. And Vienna itself becomes a war zone. These revolutionaries throw up barricades in the street. This is a revolutionary tactic that goes all the way back to the wars of religion, but it becomes especially common as these revolts, being urban affairs, are taking place in cities with narrow streets that can be blocked off. And this is a very common tactic used by the revolutionaries. Paris also kicks off. Now, Alexis de Tocqueville, who I'm going to be quoting here, is best known in America for his travels here and his comments on American society. But he also had some quite insightful things to say about France itself. Not only historical notes on the French Revolution of the decades prior, but notes on what he saw himself during his own life in France. And as he was going about Paris in 1848, he noted these things and wrote them down in 1851. I saw society cut in two, those who possess nothing united in a common greed, those who possess something united in a common terror. There were no bonds, no sympathy between these two great sections. Everywhere the idea of an inevitable and immediate struggle seemed at hand. And indeed, in France in 1848, a massive struggle was at hand. Same with the rest of the countries in Europe. France will unravel into a short but incredibly brutal period of civil war, as Louis-Philippe is rapidly overthrown and replaced by the Second French Republic. We'll talk about the Civil War bit of that a little later. The general pattern is that these revolutions kick up in 1848. They force concessions from their government. They force leaders to abdicate or flee. Metternich has to flee. The monarch of the Kingdom of the Two Sicilies, who's a Bourbon, like the monarchs of Spain and like the old monarchs of France, he has to run for his life. Hungary splits off from the Austrian Empire, becomes independent for about a year. And large chunks of Germany start to unite together and proclaim a unified Germany, in opposition to all of these independent German leaders. Now, the second phase is the crackdown. Now, in many cases, this will involve the Russian army itself going in. Russia is one of the few countries that spared any sort of revolutionary chaos within Russia proper. Poland kicks off, much to their dismay. But the Russians move in, they crush the rebellions in Eastern Europe. They, in fact, help out the Austrians, as we discussed in the last lecture, which these big empires in competition usually aren't want to help one another. In this case, the Russians, they're so fearful of revolution, they move in and they help the Austrians defeat the Hungarians. The Habsburg armies move quickly as well. They move into Italy and they rout the Italian armies in northern Italy. and bring them back into the Habsburg fold. So militarily, in much of Europe, the revolutionary armies are defeated. The nationalist, liberal, and radical forces are beaten. The overall results of the revolutions, which really don't resolve themselves until 1849, are as follows. Most of the revolutions and independence movements are defeated. Vienna comes back under the control of the Habsburg government. Hungary is incorporated back into the Austrian Empire. Italy is brought back under the Habsburgs. That unified Germany they were attempting to set up is crushed temporarily for the next 20 years. The big exception being France, where they do chase out Louis Philippe and they become a republic again. They're only going to stay a republic for a little bit, for a couple of years. The thing is, though, in the early stages of the revolution, some of these concessions that are made stick. So in most of Europe outside of Russia, serfdom is abolished. Serfdom being the system of essentially slavery, which a lot of peasants were kept. And the press censorship that had been so biting to people in Vienna and people in the Austrian Empire is revoked. And a number of European governments, the Dutch government, the Danish government, adopt far more democratic forms of government that have lasted to this day. We also see is a growth of nationalism, of national feeling, particularly in Germany and Italy. The Italians struggled desperately against the Habsburgs. They struggled desperately against the Bourbons. As they see it, this revolution of 1848, that's still viewed this way in Italy, is an Italian War of Independence, usually called the First Italian War of Independence. Now, they're beaten, but the struggle is something they still remember to this day, and something they'll remember in 20 or so years when they gain their independence. And not independence, rather when they gain their unity as a single Italian kingdom. The Frankfurt Parliament, the flag that the Frankfurt Parliament invents to symbolize Germany, without any royal insignias, without any noble families stamp upon it, will eventually become the flag of modern Germany. The tricolor flag, designed by the Irish revolutionaries of 1848, who also ultimately failed in a far more embarrassing way. The extent of their military success was an attack on a farmhouse where they were defeated with 2 casualties. The Battle of Widow McCormick's Cabbage Patch, as people called it. But they do design a flag. Remains the Irish flag today, the orange, white, and green. Once again, these are symbols of the nation. They don't have any insignia on them that says this nation is essentially the property of a single family or of a single dynasty. These try to be symbols of an entire people. So these are the broad results of 1848. Another result of 1848 is that the radicals are furious, especially by what happens in France. Now, the civil war that breaks out in France is not between the revolutionaries and Louis Philippe. Louis Philippe clears out pretty quickly, and a republic is established. But when the republic institutes some of its reforms, one of the things they set up are national workhouses, ateliers nationaux, which are these stations which basically guarantee jobs for the working poor of Paris and of the other major cities. The problem comes when general elections are held. Now, these national workhouses, the radicals, the workers of the major cities, they love these. They guarantee a certain standard of living. They guarantee they're not going to starve if they get fired or if their wages are decreased. The problem is, who's paying for them? Most of the population in France is rural, and they're never going to use any of these. The peasants and landowners of the countryside don't want to pay for the national workhouses, so when elections are held, they vote to get rid of them. When they do get rid of them in June 1848, Paris erupts. Thousands are killed as the radicals take to the streets, barricade them, and start fighting against the troops of the Second Republic. It is a bloodbath. The death toll going into the many thousands. Eventually, the forces of the Second Republic restore order to the city, crush the revolt, but it leaves a huge sting in the mouth of radicals, not just in France, but throughout Europe. Now, with regard to the radicals, I want to give a little bit of background on who we're talking about. Radical politics, as we call it, revolutionary politics, really emerges in Europe originally as a web of conspiracies in the years after the Napoleonic Wars. The idea originally being that small revolutionary cells would operate, and through conspiracies by army officers, they would take over the state. And this remained really just an idea everywhere in Europe. Many of these early radicals were really indistinguishable from liberals, except in their secretive methods. As they saw it, the big enemy was this coalition of absolutist counter-revolutionary states, Bourbon Naples, Austria, Prussia, and the most powerful, autocratic, and terrifying of all of them, Russia. These radicals, and this wouldn't change for many decades and is still true in 1848, viewed the Russian army with the same kind of horror that European Protestants viewed the Spanish Habsburg army 200 years before. And just like Spain had tried to impose the Counter-Reformation on Europe and bring back Catholicism by force, Russia, they feared, would try and impose a counter-revolution. Now, amidst all of these revolutions, amidst 1830 and 1848, many of these radicals were hoping for salvation from France. But even though France will undergo these revolutions, they'll never fulfill the desire of the radicals, which is to then take the revolution and export it elsewhere. And in the 1830s, these hopes for a coordinated Europe-wide revolution start to fail, and the radicals start to welcome disaffected members of the working class into their fold. And this is what we see in 1848. What began as a small movement among down-and-out elites becomes a movement whose primary concerns are those of the workers and whose main constituents and supporters are the urban poor. In 1848, in particular, these radicals, with their constituents being the working poor, their concerns being those of the urban poor, will team up with liberals to achieve certain common goals. Neither of them want absolute monarchs. Neither of them want voting rights to be restricted. But they were always tremendously paranoid about being betrayed by the liberals, and the liberals were terrified of being betrayed by them. So there's incredible mistrust between these groups. And in the June days, as they're called, in the Civil War in France, you see this distrust mount into a civil war between liberals and radicals, which liberals will win. The radicals feel betrayed by those they had helped take power. After all, who had chased out Louis Philippe? It wasn't the middle class, really. It had been the workers who supported the liberals. And now the liberals were turning around, getting rid of the national workhouses, and the radicals felt they had no recourse but to rise up. Now, just a quick summary of France's political back and forths. In 1848, they established a new republic. But 4 years later, the president of the republic, Louis Napoleon, after a plebiscite, gets himself crowned as Emperor Napoleon III. He is the nephew of Napoleon Bonaparte. He's a fascinating guy, maybe even more interesting than his uncle, but nevertheless, we must move on. Then in 1870, as the Prussians defeat his army, after he's captured in battle, he's deposed, and the Third Republic is established. The Third Republic, though, has to do what the Second Republic did very early on and go to war with the radicals. And this war is perhaps even more bloody, and it also takes place in Paris, the war over the Paris Commune. The radicals establish a commune in Paris, a communist sort of outpost, and over the course of a number of weeks are slowly defeated by the forces of the Third Republic. In 1870, that Third Republic is established. It'll last until the Second World War, although there's quite a bit of chaos in between. Now, in many ways, socialism communism, these are old ideas. There have frequently been people who've denounced private property, who've denounced inequality, and who've wanted completely equal societies. We saw hints of this in 1525, when the German peasants rose up against the nobles, those peasants whom Luther would denounce. We see that in other parts of the world. In Iran, the prophet Mazdak advocated for the abolition of private property, advocated for the abolition of all social and uh, um, uh, and monetary distinctions between people. He was put to death for that. That was in the 520s. That was well over 1,500 years ago. Actually, that was almost exactly 1,500 years ago. But as the 19th century churned on, there were many people who felt that these ideas were finally feasible. Why is that? Now, we talked a little bit in our lecture about the Industrial Revolution, about how the Industrial Revolution ended the necessity of mass poverty. It increased the amount of wealth in the world tremendously, increased the efficiency of the economy, increased the just the ability of even poor people to have enough to get by in a way that had not been possible previously. It released people from the constant fear of famine. And as it spread, as its methods spread, the Industrial Revolution has released most of humanity from those fears. And for the first time, it's envisioned that if all the wealth in the world is spread around equally, the average person could be thought to live a relatively comfortable life. The sheer power of industry is what led people to finally believe, in many cases, that communism could work. To be clear and distinguish between socialism and communism, socialism refers specifically to when factories, natural resources, and labor are in the hands of a collective or in the hands of the state, when they're not privately owned. Communism includes that, but it also says communism is this sort of utopian state of having no private property, no social distinctions or classes. There's no money being used, and there is no state at all. It's people living and sharing things, essentially, is the vision of communism. Perhaps the most prominent communist in the 19th century, or at least the most important going into the 20th, was Karl Marx, who was an economist, philosopher, and ideologue of communism. He viewed history as simply a catalog of class struggle. This is the way he understood the past. This is the way he thought history would play out. This is how he believed the human story had played out for all of time. I will now quote him. The history of all hitherto existing societies is the history of class struggle. Freeman and slave, lord and serf, in a word, oppressor and oppressed, stood in constant opposition to one another, carried on an interrupted, now hidden, now open fight, a fight that each time ended in either a revolutionary reconstitution of society at large or in the common ruin of the contending classes. According to Marx and his analysis, human conflicts throughout history were mostly guises for economic conflicts. The wars fought over the Reformation, in the views of Marxists, might be said not to really have been wars about religion. In fact, they were really wars over class. It was the nobles trying to get a bigger slice of the pie from the church. It didn't really have to do with people's beliefs so much. Their beliefs were guided by their class interests, and so on and so forth. This is a major reinterpretation of history and of motivations of people in history. It remains influential, though far less so than it had been to this day. And according to Marx, history followed a certain pattern and would follow a certain pattern. To be clear, to Marx, this is not something that might happen or something that's likely to happen. This is a set formula. by which history will proceed and must proceed scientifically, as determined by economics and the conflict between classes. So what I'm about to explain to you, the progress of history as Marx describes it, and what he talks about happening in the future, to Marx and to orthodox Marxists, to people who really hold by these ideas, this isn't just an idea. This isn't just what's likely to happen. This isn't just a prediction. This is what will happen, 100%. Now I'm going to describe these beliefs. The first set of relations are those that, post-civilization, are those which are described as feudalism, which we've talked about earlier, this, system where, those who pray, those who fight, those who work, where societies are ruled by the nobles and by kings. And then developed societies would be struck by series of bourgeois revolutions or middle class revolutions, where the bourgeoisie or the middle class would tear down feudalism. They would tear down the kings and they would rule themselves. These were people who were not nobles, they were middle class. They were merchants, they were bankers, they were the wealthy, not those who were of the old ancestries. And these revolutions included the English Revolution in Britain in the 1640s and the Glorious Revolution of 1688, the American Revolution of 1776, the French Revolution of 1789. The middle classes tearing down the nobles and the kings and setting themselves up as the most powerful people in society. The period of rule by the bourgeoisie, by those who succeeded in toppling the aristocrats and the kings, is what is known to Marx as capitalism. This is the rule of society by the bourgeoisie, where the owners of capital, where the bosses are the ones who have the power, where the means of production are in private hands, in the hands of the bourgeoisie, and they dominate an ever-growing working class who are working in miserable conditions. This phase of industrial capitalism was incredibly important to Marx. When we talk about Marx's view and the Marxist view of capitalism and of industry, it's important to note that for Marxists, capitalism is a tremendously important stage in the achievement of communism. It's not just the opposite of communism, which, they say it is, but it is revolutionary in and of itself. Marxists will not dispute that capitalism is efficient and creates wealth and creates innovation. What they will say is that capitalism increases inequality and it increases the extent of oppression of the working classes. That bosses push wages down. That it subjects the economy to panics and crashes. But what they will also say is that capitalism, by organizing the workers, by physically concentrating them in cities, by putting them to work, by, in many ways, teaching them how to work, it creates the conditions for the working class to eventually take over. There's a quotation that is sometimes misattributed to the Marxist revolutionary Lenin. I don't think he actually said it. He said, "The capitalists will make the rope with which we will hang them." But it, even though the quote is apocryphal, it does encapsulate a certain way Marxists think about capitalism. It generates the conditions for what are believed to be inevitable communist revolutions. Now, the capitalists themselves, when Marx writes about them, you can almost see a hint of admiration. These people are incredibly clever. They don't care about the old distinctions of nobility. They don't care about these kings. They want to rule for their own personal profit. But overall, Marx largely detested them, as did the communists, even if they saw them as, even if they saw the rule of the bourgeoisie as an inevitable step. From capitalism, according to Marx, will emerge an inevitable workers' revolution. They are now organized. They're not going to put up with their bad wages. They are going to know, and their bad conditions, and they know very well that the wealth of their bosses depends upon them. So they will demand to rule themselves. They will demand that the factories and the means of production be turned over to them for collective ownership. And at that point, you have a period of time which revolutionaries, now Marx did not invent this concept, it was kind of pioneered by Louis Blanc, another revolutionary who lived a little earlier than him. You have this idea of the dictatorship of the proletariat. Now, let's just say this is as far as it's ever gotten. This is a period of time where the working classes band together and kill the middle class. They kill the bourgeoisie, and they take their things. It's a period of war, of destruction, of the enemies of the working class, and of the redistribution of all of their wealth. The dismantling of capitalism, the transfer of everything to collective ownership, and the destruction of all material distinctions between people. This is the point at which things get a little odd, as if they haven't been a little odd already. And this is something that Marx never really went into a tremendous amount of detail about, somewhat disappointingly. What Marx believed is that upon the crushing of the bourgeoisie and the removal of class distinctions and therefore class conflict, that the need for a state would wither away and disappear. The state would disappear as a result of there no longer being distinctions between the classes. If you like, I can go into a bit more detail about this, but frankly, I'm not sure I entirely understand it myself. In any case, this will lead, in time, to stateless society, a society without classes, a society without property, a society without religion, encompassing the entire globe, global communism. And that, to Marx, is the final stage, the final inevitable stage of humankind, and to many Marxists today. Once again, they do not view this as a possible future, as a possible prediction. Marx and his followers, and some of his followers today, but the people who will, for instance, establish the Soviet Union, believe that this is inevitable, that this is just how history is going to go. If you stand against them, you're standing against the tide of history. Of course, there is something rather interesting about all this, which is, well, according to this view, what countries should be the first ones to have revolutions? If industrial capitalism creates the conditions for communist revolutions, the countries that have the most advanced systems of industry, the most advanced capitalist economies, those should be the ones that have revolutions first. Specifically places like Britain and Marx's native Germany. But in those countries, they never take place. What does happen instead is that communist revolutions will kick off in largely agricultural countries, the two largest of them being Russia and China. A somewhat odd phenomenon. That is not what Marx would have expected. Marx did appreciate tremendous revolutionary potential in Russia, but he didn't expect a workers' revolution in a country where a minuscule percentage of the people were workers at all. Workers as in industrial workers, let's be clear. When he's talking about workers' revolutions, he's not talking about peasants. This is after the peasants, through industrial capitalism, have already been transformed into members of the working class, according to his view. So he didn't live to see it. He died in 1883, but I think he would have been quite stunned to see revolution kick off in Russia. A communist revolution modeled off his ideas kick off in Russia before anywhere else. And many Russians and Russian Marxists were quite shocked by that as well. All right, why didn't it work? the reason communist revolutions never kicked off in the industrialized world is because even though things are extremely rough for the workers throughout the 1800s, they start to get better toward the end. Conditions do start to improve. Governments do start restricting the hours that bosses can force workers to labor. They start imposing minimum wages. They start bringing in social insurance. And when the workers strike, they're not striking in most cases to take control of the factories or take control of the means of production. They're usually striking for better wages. In many cases, they adopt the symbols of their nation. Here are some striking workers from the early 1900s waving American flags. They don't see their struggle as necessarily the opposite of that of the nation and of their ruling classes. They see it as a part of it. And these governments, hoping to satisfy their people, hoping to prevent revolutions in the style Marx describes, are in most cases willing to give concessions. And so the lot of people in general improves enough in the industrialized world to prevent these revolutions from taking place. A communist revolution of the style described by Marx will basically never happen in an industrialized society. So, in a sense, that part of his theory has been quite off. Now, to summarize the political situation, there's a lot of different ins and outs we could go into here. We could do probably 3 lectures on Europe in the 19th century. As it happens, we're going to touch upon Europe in this period only one more time when we talk about advancements in science and philosophy in the 19th century, and that's going to be quite a bit later. That's going to be right before our lecture on World War I. But I wish merely here to summarize what we've discussed in the past few lectures with regard to Europe. How does the map change? First of all, you can see a lot of countries moving from absolute monarchies, monarchies that have no legal limits on their power, to constitutional ones, to the point where by the outbreak of World War I, the only thing you can even start to call an absolute monarchy in Europe is Russia. All the other countries have adopted constitutions of some sort. Portugal and France have become republics, Portugal in 1910, but France in 1870. That little bit in red in Africa these are French colonies. Germany and Italy are now unified. Italy will not yet be a great power, although it's a power, whereas Germany will be intensely powerful, something we'll talk a little bit about later. These constitutional governments are now in place across Europe. There have been massive increases in the wealth of the Europeans, in the efficiency of their economies, and in the inequalities between people, and in the fact that these inequalities are so apparent because of how close people live to one another. Now, across the 19th century, there are wars between European countries. We talked about a couple of them already, but there aren't that many, and there isn't a general war. We saw a whole bunch of those in the 16th centuries, 17th centuries, 18th centuries. In the 19th century, you don't really have that situation where it's coalitions of European countries teaming up against each other. The closest you get to that is in the 1850s when Britain, France, and the Turks team up and fight a limited war with Russia over the Crimea, which we may actually talk a little bit about in the next lecture because of its implications on the end of serfdom in Russia. But in any case, for the most part, there's peace between these countries, partly because they're unleashing a lot of their vigor and energy on the rest of the world at this point. But there's a great deal of revolution within these countries, and a great deal of reform within these nations, and frankly, a lot of tension between them too. So even though there is no great war for these 100 years, it's not entirely smooth sailing, although it's a period of relative peace, relative as in compared to other times. So that about wraps it up. In the next lecture, we'll go back in time a little bit to talk about the end of slavery in the United States. Mostly, we're going to focus on America. We may talk a little bit about Britain and Russia. I'm not sure yet. We'll see what we have time for. In any case, I will be seeing you Wednesday. And a reminder, first of all, there was that little assignment I posted for you to do, that short writing assignment on the bourgeoisie, middle class. Hopefully you'll have that ready for me on Wednesday. And remember, you'll be quizzed on some of this material here in this lecture. Let me know if you have any questions, and I hope you enjoy the rest of your vacation. See you soon.